All right, welcome. Welcome everyone, good evening and welcome to the Center for Studies in Religion and Societies Thursday Public Lecture. My name is Kathy Chan and I am the Acting Director of the CSRS for the 2022-23 academic year. I'd like to open tonight's lecture by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are holding this lecture series, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples who have continuing historical relationships with this land. I'm very pleased today to introduce one of the two faculty fellows at the CSRS this year, Dr. Zhongping Chen. Dr. Chen is a professor in the history department at the University of Victoria with expertise in pre-modern and modern Chinese history, including the history of the global Chinese diaspora. He has studied and taught at Nanjing University, the University of Hawaii, Trent University, and at McGill. And very recently, Dr. Chen won the Faculty of Humanities Award for Excellence in Research at the University of Victoria. And we offer our congratulations for that accomplishment. We've enjoyed having Dr. Chen as a faculty fellow this fall, and I look forward to his talk on religion, racism, and rivalries in North American Chinatowns. So welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank all of you for attending the lecture, either in the classroom or online. The title of my lecture is Religion, Racism, and the Rivalry in North American Chinatowns from 1896 to 1916. This actually is a result of my research for my forthcoming book, Trans-Pacific Reform and the Revolution, the Chinese in North America from 1898 to 1918. So the book will come out in next year. So here I just presented the book cover, the cover of the book for my introduction to the background of my lecture. This actually is a portion of the post of the Chinese Empire Ladies Reform Association. At the top of this portion of the picture, so that is Emperor Guangxu of Qing China. He ruled China, Qing China, from 1875 to 1908. The man right to him is Kang Youwei. He lived between 1858 to 1927. Both the emperor, the young emperor, and Kang Youwei led China's first political reform in 1898. But the reform was suppressed by the end of the emperor, Empress Dowager Cixi, and her conservative faction. Then Kang Youwei fled from China to Hong Kong, to Japan, and finally came to Canada. In Canada, he established the Chinese Empire Reform Association for China's constitutional reform. And so the organization was started from Victoria on July 20th, 1899. And then this association started from Victoria, spread to the whole world, and developed more than 200 chapters in North America, South America, Asia, Australia. I think it also developed 2 chapters in Africa, none in Europe for unknown reason. The lady in the picture is Kang Tongbi. She lived between 1881 and 1969. She was the second daughter of Kang Youwei. She also came to Victoria and established the Chinese Empire Ladies Reform Association in Victoria in May 1903. And this women's organization then developed more than 10 branches or chapters in Canada and the United States, spreading from Victoria and then to Vancouver, New Westminster. Seattle, Portland, Astoria, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, Honolulu. This actually was the first Chinese women's political organization in 1,000 years of Chinese history among the Chinese, either inside China or outside China. And he called for women's rights in education and in politics through constitutional reform. Before this organization appeared in Victoria, Chinese women organized only some educational associations in Shanghai, or the mutual aid organization for women, female students in Japan. And the interesting is the first Chinese women's political organization appeared in Victoria. Almost nobody knew that until I published one article a couple years ago. Another historical figure is Sun Yat-sen. This picture should appear here. Sun Yat-sen lived between 1866 and 1925, and he was the first provisional president of Republican China in 1912. And he first founded the Revived China Society for China's Republican Revolution in Honolulu in 1894. And later he established its first North American chapter in San Francisco in 1896. Later he reorganized his organization into a Revolution Alliance. And his organization received the largest donation from Victoria's Chinese Freemasons for his anti-Qing uprising in China in early 1911. In the Republican period, he led a Chinese National League, and then Chinese National League, also called the Chinese National Party inside China. It developed more than 100 chapters in the United States and in Canada. And so by 1916. So that is basically the background information for my lecture. So right now, this is Sun Yat-sen. Right now, let's turn to the religious and racial issues in Chinese reform and revolution. First, let's talk about Kang Youwei's religious and racial thoughts. Kang Youwei actually was born to a Confucian scholar official family in the place near Canton, today called Guangzhou, near Hong Kong. But just because Canton, or today called Guangzhou, is near Hong Kong, so he also received a strong Western influence. So although usually people assume Confucianism is kind of conservative idea, but Kang Youwei argued Confucianism includes a similar idea like Darwin's evolution theory. So that's why he presented the Confucian evolutionism, and he argued that Confucius also stressed that there will be social evolution from one stage to a more advanced stage. Because the society would evolve from one stage to another stage, the political system should also change. So that's why China should change from its traditional Chinese imperial political system to the Western style constitutional monarchy. So that he actually used this, the Confucian evolutionism to justify his political reforms, because Confucianism was state ideology in China at that time. And he also argued Confucianism is a more humanistic and more scientific religion than Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. The reason is Confucianism itself, I think you know something about Confucianism. Confucianism itself is more like a philosophy rather than religion. It mainly is a concern about the moral nature, moral education, and moral improvement of human beings, rather than about a spiritual life, in other words. So Confucius once, one of his students asked him one question about life after the death. Confucius' answer was, if you do not understand life, how could you understand death? So Confucius was more concerned about life in this world rather than about the spiritual life in another world. So that's why Kang Youwei argued, this is a more progressive, humanistic, and scientific idea than Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, because all the other world religions are more like substitutions. They have the substitution beliefs in supernatural beings, either gods or ghosts. But he argued that Confucianism was more scientific, more concerned about the human society. And especially after China was defeated by Japan in their war from 1894 to 1895, Kang Youwei felt a threat not only from the Western gunpowder policies, but also from Western culture like Christianity. So that's why he called Christianity the heretical sect of foreign barbarians. And he then, in 1898, he established a short-lived organization called a Society to Protect the Nation. But this Society to Protect the Nation promised it would not only protect the Chinese nation, but also Chinese race and Confucianism against the Western threat, including the threat from Christianity. Kang Youwei later completed a book in 1902. The English translation was published in 1958. The book actually was very influential. It was not published in his life, but later it became very influential. In this book, he presented a plan for a utopian world without a national boundary, without a class division, without the racial separation, without a gender disparity. So this actually was most favorite reading because this was very close to communist idea of a communist paradise, right? But he also argued this kind of utopian society would result from human evolution. So that actually will result also from the human evolution toward the racial fusion of white and yellow races, but without the black and the brown races. Because at that time, among the anthropologists, either in the West or in China, they usually divide the human being into 4 or 5 races, the white race, yellow race, black race, brown race, right? So his idea was, on the impact of the white supremacy. He said that white people are the smartest, but he said a yellow race actually is also smart people, but he said the black and brown races, and these people are too backward. They would be extinct through the human evolution. Right now, let's talk a little about Sun Yat-sen's religious and racial thoughts. Sun Yat-sen actually was born to a poor peasant family in Canton, near Canton, also near Hong Kong. But just because his elder brother migrated to Hawaii and made a fortune there, so that's why he followed his elder brother and migrated to Hawaii. And then he entered the missionary school, received a Western education from 1879. And so that's why he later baptized as a Christian in Hong Kong in 1884. So you can find that he was totally different from Kang Youwei. And he later founded the Revived China Society as the first revolution organization in Honolulu, and he required all the members of this society to take an oath with the Bible in hand. The oath is expel Manchu barbarians from China, revive Chinese rule, and establish a republic. So you can find, both his religious and his racial source here. By the way, his organization was against the Manchu. Mainly the Manchu were ethnic minority. They came from Manchuria, but conquered China, established the last dynasty in Imperial China, the Qing Dynasty, from 1644. The Manchu people actually later became so Chineseized. They accepted Chinese culture and already became part of China. And later, Chen established the Revolution Alliance with another set of oaths. That's almost the same as the one for his first revolution organization. The oath is expel Manchu barbarians, revive Chinese rule, equalize land ownership, and establish a republic. So that organization was established in Tokyo in 1905. Again, you can find both his racial and religious racial idea here in these oaths of this organization. After his revolution succeeded in China, so the Republican Revolution in around 1911, he became the provisional president of Republican China for a while. But at that time, he began to call for a Chinese Republic of China of 5 races. And these 5 races, including the Manchu, Chinese, Manchu, Mongolian, Muslim, and Tibetan. In the Republican period, Sun Yat-sen led his party called the Chinese National Party in China. But this party's title in North America was called Chinese National League. So it promoted religious freedom for Christianity and other religions against the Kang Youwei's plan for establishment of the Confucian state religion. So these are just the religious and the racial thoughts of the leading reform and revolutionary. So right now, let's turn to the religious and the racial politics in North American Chinatowns. Kang Youwei, after he came to Victoria in early 1899, he first issued a call for the worship of Confucius on Confucius' birthday, starting from Victoria. And he also issued a call for the establishment of Confucianism as a state religion of China. Again, he issued the call from Victoria. He did that actually mainly for his political reform. If you just look at the Canadian census in 1901, here I just presented data about first 10 Chinese in the census in Victoria's Chinatown in 1901. By the way, from the table, you can find all these Chinese, their surnames are called A or R. This is wrong. R actually is a prefix of the nickname of Cantonese, just like a mist and miss in English. But the census taker, they did not understand that. They just used all the prefix as their surname. But anyway, if you look at this table, oh, by the way, at that time, the Chinese migrants, mostly were men. They were not bringing their wives here. There are 2 reasons. First reason, in China, women were not supposed to leave home, to leave their home place for foreign countries. Another reason is anti-Chinese racism. Like in Canada, each woman came to Canada, they had to pay $50 tax, head tax. But after 1903, they had to pay $500 of head tax. So that's why most Chinese men would not bring their wives, children to Victoria, to Canada or the United States. So if you just look at this census data, you can find interesting, and 9 of these Chinese were born in China, but only 1 was born in British Columbia. But all of them, almost all of them, claimed they were Confucian, except that the first one and last one is, the choice was unclear or not given. So that is actually the reason why Kang Youwei promoted Confucianism, because he tried to use that to promote his political reforms. He also established the Chinese Empire Reform Association. And this association, the Chinese title actually was Bao Huanghui. Bao Huanghui means the Society to Protect the Emperor, the Guangxi Emperor, because the Guangxi Emperor already put under house arrest after the 1898 reform failed. But this organization promised to protect not the Guangxi Emperor, but also Chinese nation and the yellow races. Again, the yellow race, later was used as a derogatory term in Western media, but at that time it was a common usage in anthropology in the West, in Japan, in China. But the Kang Youwei used the yellow race to refer both Chinese and the Manchu, because that actually could help promote the political reform in the Qing government under Manchu rule, rather than exclude the Manchu from China, as Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionists did. But in Victoria, he also dropped the slogan of protecting Confucianism against Christianity, because his purpose was to recruit the Chinese Christians into his organization. But anyway, because his promotion of Confucianism still was in contention with the Christian community in Victoria. So that's why when the minister of the Methodist Church in Victoria Chinatown called all the members of the church to unite with the Christian mission rather than with the Kang Youwei organization. So that's why on the eve of the Christmas of 1899, one pipe bomb, very primitive pipe bomb with a timer fuse exploded on the window, outside of the window of the church. It just caused damage to the glasses of window, but it caused a big panic inside among the audience, Chinese audience inside the church. So immediately, the local newspaper reported the Kang Youwei organization actually caused was the bomber of the church. But this just reflects the contention between Kang Youwei's reforms organization and the local Christian community. After Kang Youwei dropped the slogan of protecting Confucianism against Christianity, he also get support from a very influential Chinese Christian newspaper in San Francisco. English title is Sino-Western Daily. This Christian newspaper first sponsored his reform, but just because of contention, the contradiction between Kang Youwei's promotion of Christianity and this Christian newspaper. Finally, this Christian newspaper turned against the reform in 1904. In Vancouver, there appeared a Chinese Christian newspaper called Chinese English Daily in English, the title in English. It also turned from Christian reform. It actually originally promoted Christian reform under Kang Youwei's influence. It mainly promoted the Christian reform against like opium smoking, like gambling, like prostitution among the Chinese. But just because it's a clash with the Kang Youwei's organization, it also turned to anti-Qing revolution propaganda from 1907. But anyway, the number of the Chinese Christians actually was not that large. Like in Victoria's Chinatown, in 1909, there were only about 60 to 75 Chinese Christians. So their attitude actually did not really affect Kang Youwei's reforms movement very much. Kang Youwei's movement finally failed, mainly because the Guangxi Emperor died in 1908, because his organization, CELA, the Chinese Empire Reform Association, the title actually was called the Society to Protect the Emperor. When the emperor died, certainly it lost, the people to protect. But this organization did not disappear. It actually continued as a constitutional party in China and South China and until 1920s. So it continued to compete with Sun Yat-sen's revolution organizations. So right now, let's turn to Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen founded the the revived Chinese society in Honolulu at first, but in 1896, he established the first North American chapter of this revolutionary organization in San Francisco, but only a few Christians, because they were Sun Yat-sen's Christian fellows. They joined his organization. In 1904, the organization in 1896 quickly disappeared. In 1904, Sun Yat-sen re-established this organization in San Francisco, but only one single Christian guy, a Christian fellow, joined his organization. Sun Yat-sen first visited Canada from Europe in 1897. At that time, Sun Yat-sen was regarded as a rapper. He was on the most wanted list of the Qing government. So no Chinese dared to help him. But he actually received help from the Christian churches, the Methodist churches in Vancouver, Nanaimo, and Victoria. He secured the lodging in each of these churches for one night. In particular, in 1904, when Sun Yat-sen tried started from Hawaii and tried to enter American mainland, because Sun Yat-sen lived in Hawaii for a long time as an immigrant. So he used his Hawaiian connection and forged some documents, including his his birth certificate in Hawaii. So that actually would have allowed him to become American citizen. So that's why he could enter the United States. Oh, by the way, in the United States, starting from 1882, imposed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese were not allowed to enter the United States unless they got a certificate special certificate from the Qing government. But he claimed he was American citizen and was born in Hawaii. So that's why he arrived in San Francisco. But immediately he was found by the American Immigration Authority. He was arrested and put into jail and was ready to deport him to China. If he were deported to China, he would be executed immediately. But fortunately, he got help from the Christian editor of the Christian newspaper, the Sign of Western Daily, because he was a Christian. And also because in Hawaii, he joined the Charter Society, or the later called Chinese Freemasons in Hawaii. So that's why he also got help from the American headquarters of Chinese Freemasons or Charter Society in San Francisco. By the way, in the Western media today, they usually call the Charter Society criminal organization. That is not really accurate. The Charter Society originally was the organization of the poor people for self-protection and mutual assistance. But in the Western media, it got a bad reputation. Mainly, as I just mentioned, most Chinese migrants in that time in either Canada or the United States were men. So that's why they would not bring their wives and children to Canada or the United States. So they were engaged in opium smoking, gambling, and prostitution. So also 80 to 90% of the Chinese migrants would join the Charter Society, because Charter Society was supposed to be, for mutual assistance and self-protection organization for them. But the Charter Society monopolized this kind of, opium smuggling, prostitution, and gambling. So that's why it got the bad reputation in Western media. But it actually was mainly organization for the poor Chinese migrants in North America. After that, Sun Yat-sen tried to reorganize the Chinese Freemasons in San Francisco with a Republican ideology, tried to turn that into a pro-revolution organization, but he failed. Even in 1909 to 1910, Sun Yat-sen with the United States again, he achieved only limited success in founding a dozen of chapters of Revolution Alliance in the United States. But Sun Yat-sen's Revolution Alliance in Canada actually effectively used the Canadian Chinese Freemasons, anti-Manchu and pro-Chinese racial slogan for fundraising in Victoria in 1911. In February 1911, Sun Yat-sen came to Victoria and he, as I said, he actually received the largest overseas Chinese donation from Victoria's Chinese Freemasons. And then at that time, Victoria was had the headquarters of Canadian Chinese Freemasons. So later, other Chinese Freemasons chapters also made a donation to Sun Yat-sen's revolution organization. So quickly, Sun Yat-sen's revolution happened, Republican Revolution happened in China in 1911, and he went back to China, became the provisional president of Republican China, but just for a couple months. Chinese political situation from 1912 was too complicated, too confusing. I will not go to detail here. I just want to mention Sun Yat-sen quickly lost his provisional presidency to a more powerful military man. But his party, his national party in Canada or the United States was called a Chinese National League. So this party actually dominated the Beijing parliament twice. First time in 1913 and second time in 1916. In both times, it engaged in religious and political competition with the Kang Youwei's groups. So the final topic of my lecture is the religious and political rivalry from the Beijing parliament to Victoria's Chinatown. First, Kang Youwei's partisans in Beijing parliament defended the religious freedom of Christianity, partly because Sun Yat-sen and many of his partisans were Christians. And they also twice defeated the Kang Youwei's plan for the establishment of Confucian state religion. First time in 1913 and second time in 1916. Because Kang Youwei tried to establish the Confucianism as a state religion at the expense of Christianity and other religions. So that were opposed by Sun Yat-sen's partisans. In Victoria, one of Sun Yat-sen's strong supporters and also the president of the Victoria's Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, CCBA. This was a major community organization of the Chinese at that time, even today. So the president Liu Zikui, because he felt unhappy about the parliament's decision to resolution, so to keep the religious freedom in China and reject the Kang Youwei's plan. So he sent a protest telegram on behalf of the Victoria's CCBA to Beijing and demanded the dissolution of the Beijing parliament. So the telegram was sent on September 20, 1916. So that means he actually demanded the end of Sun Yat-sen party's dominance in the parliament. So that offended the Sun Yat-sen's partisans and Sun Yat-sen's Christian fellows in Victoria. So Sun Yat-sen's partisans and his Christian fellows in Victoria stormed the CCBA meeting on October 8th, 1916, and they seriously injured 7 leaders of CCBA, including Liu Zikui. As a result, more than 10 of Sun Yat-sen's partisans were tried and then convicted by Victoria's first police court and then the county court, and finally the Aziz court by the late 1917. So that ended the story in my lecture. Right now, I want to present some conclusion, but I also want to raise some questions about my own research because the research is still going on. It has not been really concluded yet. The one sensitive issue is racism. What is racism? According to the scholar George Fredrickson in his book, Racism, A Short History, and he said racism substances or proposes to establish a racial order, a permanent group hierarchy that is believed to reflect the laws of nature or the degrees of God. And he also said racism is not operative if members of the stigmatized groups can voluntarily change their identities and advance to the position of prominence and prestige within the dominant group. So in other words, if the discriminated group of people could have a choice, change the identity, and that is not racism. This actually, raises some question I have discussed in my lecture. First, Kang Youwei promoted the patriotic political reform for Chinese progress. There's no doubt about that. That deserves the positive assessment. But the problem is Kang Youwei also promoted Confucianism against Christianity. So whether this kind of political attitude or religious attitude reflect his nationalist culturalism or his religious racism. And I hope I could hear your opinions, could help me reach a final conclusion. And also Kang Youwei called for protection of the yellow race against racism. And certainly that is also deserves to receive the positive evaluation. But the problem is he also predict a utopian world through the racial fusion of white and yellow races without the brown and black races. So this obviously reflects the impact of the white supremacy. So here you can find it actually both present the anti-racism, and he also promoted the racism. So there is a self-contradiction in his thought. And finally, Yat-sen used Christianity for his anti-Qing revolution. Although he was not a really active Christian, he rarely actually went to churches, even he was baptized. He mainly used Christianity for his revolution, and certainly that still helped his revolution. The problem is he also called the racial exclusion of the Manchu people from China and regarded them as the racial alien. So here you can find both his open mind to Western culture ranging from Christianity to republicanism, but you can also find his revolution idea reflect the racial exclusion of the Manchu people. So anyway, I just want to present both my conclusions and some questions. I hope I can hear your opinions on these questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to see if this is better now. This is not ringing. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Chen, for that wide-ranging lecture that connected two continents and the very global to the very local. There's a lot in there to think about, and I've been madly scrambling down notes. We can take questions from the floor, and we can take questions as well online. And maybe I'll start off with one of my own while people are thinking about it, because I'm a scholar in part of civil society. And there's an interesting piece in here, right, about all these associations that are feuding against each other and becoming channels for different political and religious movements, and are kind of the spaces in which these debates are taking out. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about them. I've forgotten all the different names, the Chinese Empire Reform Association, the Chinese Empire Ladies Reform Association, the Society to Protect the Nation from Western Threats, Revive China Society. Were these kind of legal associations? Because there's another dynamic, right, of the racism against the Chinese people in particular. And so I found myself wondering, is the BC government in some ways, or the Canadian state, facilitating the vehicles through which this is happening, or is there another dynamic here?
Both Kang Youwei and Yat-sen's reforms and revolution organizations before Republican China was established, all of them were illegal in China, but they were legal in Canada. Kang Youwei's organization first registered with the BC government. I believe that was in 1899. That actually influenced the Charter Society, the Chinese Freemasons, because Chinese Freemasons or Charter Society was secret organization, was secret society. Even today, it actually still secret to some extent. So the Chinese Freemasons actually under the influence of Kang Youwei's organization also registered with the BC government in 1907. Yeah, so for Sun Yat-sen's organization, because after Republic of China was established in 1912, both Kang Youwei's organization and Sun Yat-sen's organization became legal in China. Sun Yat-sen's organization also registered with the American government and the Canadian government. They were legal. Yes, they actually, these effect, had an important impact on the Chinese organization. Because usually Chinese organization before they were not registered with the Canadian government or American government. It was mainly under the impact of the reforms organization, because Kang Youwei's reform started at first. And the Chinese organization, including the CCPA, the Chinese Consultative Benevolent Association, began to register with the American government and the Canadian government. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a question online from Catherine Reardon. Catherine would like to know, these societies seem to have been primarily urban societies. There were many Chinese people living in rural Canada at the time. Were there any so-called card-carrying rural members of these societies? So is this kind of an urban-rural question, if there were?
Urban what? Urban?
Rural, like
In the country.
are the societies mostly just in the urban centers, or are there like in the countryside kind of more
So you're
separated
talking
out?
about Victoria Chinatown, right?
Right, so that's where the societies mostly were just in Chinatown in Victoria, or is there some engagement with folks, with Chinese people who were living not in Victoria's Chinatown is the question.
Before we think all the Chinese were living inside Chinatown, if you check, one publication by a later professor, David Lay, he actually was a famous professor in the geography, Department of Geography, and he did a lot of research on Chinatowns in Canada. And one of his books called The Forbidden City in Victoria, that refers to Victoria's Chinatown. And he actually basically argued, the Chinese were living inside Chinatown, and white people would not have access to Chinatown. So that's why he called the Chinatown the Forbidden City. But this has been argued against by recent publications, like in our department, Professor John Lutz and another scholar, they published one article. They argued a lot of Chinese actually also lived outside of Chinatown. And so in that case, Chinatown was more like, the cultural center or ethnic center of the Chinese. They spread in different areas of the city and even outside of Victoria. That is true. Many Chinese laundries, probably not laundries, will actually open outside of Chinatown, not inside of Chinatown. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we had a question over here. We'll just get the mic over so that the Zoom people can hear you.
Thanks so much, Zhongping. I was thinking about how problematic sometimes national and independence groups can be. I was thinking of Navalny in Russia, who were all, on his side. He's a good guy, and yet I think he's being criticized for having very nationalist, quasi-racist views on some subjects. So I was just really curious, and this is a question largely out of ignorance, but so resistance, anti-Manchu resistance movements and opposition movements, were they, it sounds like they were usually framed in racist terms or in ethnic terms, or was that not always the case?
Mhm. Okay, so until so far, almost very few scholars would call Sun Yat-sen's anti-Manchu idea racist ideas. My lecture probably one of the first to state that. That is also, I feel, kind of reluctant, in my conclusion, whether Sun Yat-sen really was a racist or not. Before, we usually call that ethnic nationalism, the Chinese ethnic nationalism against the Manchu ruler of the Qing dynasty. But if you think, he called the racial exclusion of the Manchu people from China. This actually was not only an idea. This actually led to the massacre of larger number of Manchu people in the Republican Revolution of 1911. Just recently, I read a book. Thousands of Manchu people were massacred by the revolutionaries just because they regarded the Manchu people as alien, as backward people. And so they followed Sun Yat-sen's slogan and try to kill them. But the Sun Yat-sen later, as I said, also proposed a republic of 5 races, including Manchu. But this slogan came late, after the massacre already happened, after the massacre of a large number of Manchu people already happened in 1911. He proposed this slogan after he went back to China. So that was on the Christmas Day of 1911. That was larger scale revolution already was over. The second problem is he called it the establishment of Republic of 5 races. But China actually has more than 50 ethnic groups, not the 5 races. So even his seems like open-minded slogan of establishment of the Republic of 5 races still is kind of reflect the kind of racial exclusion of other ethnic groups. Yeah. So, but this actually is a very sensitive issue. Many people say it's like a god in Chinese publication. Nobody wants to challenge him. So, this became a very sensitive issue.
Hi, thanks so much for the discussion. That was very interesting. I wanted to get a better sense of how important the diaspora was in China. Did people care very much about the opinions of people in Victoria? I mean, the relative size is just tiny compared to what's happening in Beijing. I understand Sun Yat-sen would have been very important, but how much do people care in China about what people in Victoria thought?
You mean care about what?
Well, about their political opinions, or whether they wanted to change the government, or whether there was an association to protect the emperor or to fight the emperor. I mean, who cared in China?
Okay. So usually, like the subject of my book, in Chinese, usually called overseas Chinese history. And in China, usually they think that this is just a subfield of Chinese history. And these overseas Chinese, they still committed to China's politics because they could not become Canadian citizens or American citizens. So they were still loyal to China. And they still want to make a contribution to China's economic progress, political change, either through reform or revolution. So this is called traditional historiography of overseas Chinese history. But in later, there appeared the Chinese American studies, Chinese Canadian studies. So this kind of is a kind of new line of scholarship. They want to stress the Chinese connection with adopting with the Canadian government and American government. So this line of scholarship usually we discuss like racism, or discuss the recent success of the Chinese or the Chinese migrant success as modern minority. They became successful in Canadian and American society. Many discuss the relation not with China, but with Canadian government or with American government. This is actually the second stage of the research on the Chinese overseas. They actually originally they called it overseas Chinese study. Later they called this study of Chinese overseas. The Chinese overseas means these people had origin from China, but basically they're not Chinese. They are foreign citizens of Chinese origin. Overseas is like Chinese. Overseas is like Chinese Canadians, Chinese Americans, right? Right now, actually, that appears through the stage of research on the Chinese migrants. It's called Chinese diaspora. The Chinese diaspora actually mainly discuss the relation of ethnic group, the global connection, the global migration and a global connection, a global network. My book actually discusses all the three aspects, starting from their identity as overseas Chinese, that's connection with the Chinese politics, reform and revolution in China, and also their relation with the Canadian society and American society. So far, very few scholars discuss that relation, but I argue even before they became Canadian citizens or American citizens after the Second World War, only after the Second World War, Chinese migrants could have become American citizens or Canadian citizens. But I think that they also developed the political identity with the Western political culture, like constitutional monarchy, like republicanism. These are Western ideas. They actually were fighting for this Western style of political system in China. So in that sense, they already identified with the Western polity, Western political system before they became Canadian citizens, American citizens. But my book also stresses, the book title is called Trans-Pacific Reform and Revolution. I also discuss how they actually in the whole Pacific area, they use these kind of different organizations. We mentioned so many different organizations. They became not really unified. They became connected through these kind of organizations in whole Pacific area. Because before that time, the Chinese, also they established like a family. Their Chinese companies also had their global network or Trans-Pacific network, like in Victoria Chinatown. The Chinese came to Victoria, they established a company called Kong Company. Kong Company actually had its family network across the whole Pacific area. Its headquarters was in Victoria, but it also had sister companies in San Francisco, in Hong Kong, in Canton. It actually had branches, dozen branches in the gold mine field in British Columbia. So, but this organization, they were not, they had no universal networks. And so, but the Reforms Organization and Revolution Organization, spread to almost all the Chinese community and linked them together in the whole Pacific area. So that's why I use this title here. So the Reform and Revolution of the Chinese North America was not limited to North America. They actually spread to the whole Pacific area, also linked to politics in China. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So people didn't care then, they care now.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Rachel.
So there's another question from Zoom from Fui Xun, and they ask, both Kang and Sun are Cantonese. Cantonese had a deep tradition of Confucian lineage and interactions with foreigners. Do you think that their Cantonese identity might have something to do with their religious or racist thoughts? So linking the language group and the specific context of Cantonese to the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is actually a very good question and also complicated because like nationalism in the West, they started from the destruction of loyalty to the small feudal kingdom to a larger nation. But Chinese nationalism, a few recent publications, they believe Chinese nationalism started from the loyalty of your lineage, your local community, and your province to the nation. So so that's why Cantonese, they argue Cantonese identity actually is a foundation of the kind of Chinese nationalism. For example, I discussed reform and revolution. This is very interesting. Among the early Chinese migrants, almost 99% came from Guangdong province. They were Cantonese. Also, they did not come from Hubei province. They came from about 8 counties. Almost 99% of them came from 8 counties around Canton or near Hong Kong. So they first had they had kept the local identity. They were had a connection with their home place, their home county in China. But through this kind of reform evolution, they gradually developed the broader identity with the Chinese nation. And also, as I said, with even developed the identity with the Trans-Pacific Chinese diaspora in the whole Pacific area. This actually was kind of important, the change. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe one final question from me. We're almost out of time, but you've almost finished this book project now and done this big study of Chinatowns. Has it caused you to want to move in a different direction, or do you think you'll delve further into the Chinese diaspora in this area?
Okay.
Next?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my book originally, the plan was very ambitious. It actually usually assumed Chinese migration to the United States, starting from the Gold Rush from California in 1848, and in Canada, started from the Gold Rush in British in Fraser River from 1858. But actually, the larger number of Chinese came to today called Canada as early as 1788. I actually found about more than 200 Chinese came, at that time, not for gold rush, for fur trade. And also, actually, the Chinese migration in Canada had a connection with the British colony of the whole West Coast. Up to 1788, the British government had no inch of land on the West Coast, as we knew. It had like a New England, certainly it lost New England to the United States already. But anyway, its colony mainly were on the East Coast. In the West Coast, it had no land. But in 1788, there was one British captain, and he came to our island. It's actually not our island, it's called Notak Island, on the west coast of Vancouver Island. At that time, it actually developed the fur trade with Canton in China. The fur in Canada mainly came from sea otters. And the sea otter trade actually mainly on the west coast, mainly the center is on Notak Island, small island. West is near the Golden River, yeah, near Golden River on our island. So, the British captain brought the European captain, the sailors, to here for the fur trade. But this guy, was afraid at that time the European the captain usually would have lead their sailors to Hawaii for winter because it was too cold on the west coast of North America. But this guy was he put his sailors in Alaska, and many of his sailors died in the winter in Alaska. Later, he had to bring the Chinese sailors, and he actually tried to establish the British colony in Notak Island at first. And with the help of Chinese laborers, let the Chinese laborers marry with Hawaiian women. Because at that time, in order to bring the British immigrants to West Coast, they had to take a long way. At that time, there was no Panama Canal yet. So that's why he tried to use the Chinese laborers to build the British colony. But unfortunately, there was competition between the British Empire and the Spanish Empire. Oh. So the Spanish colonial authority in Mexico, they sent worshippers to the Notak Island, stormed the settlement of Chinese. They took the Chinese to Mexico. And some Chinese actually fled from the Spanish hands. They stayed in Mexico. But most Chinese were sent back to China. This actually was the beginning of Western, the British colonization on the West Coast, because there was a competition, there was almost a war between Britain and Spain for this issue. But later, because Spain lost its major ally, France, in French Revolution in 1799. So that's why the Spanish Empire had to make a concession to British Empire, allowed the British government to take a small land on Natak Island. So that's why the George Vancouver came
Well,
in
we will,
1892, and then took the first British colony on Vancouver Island. And also our island was called, at that time was called Quadra Vancouver Island, because the George Vancouver actually got very well with the British, Spanish captain. That guy, the surname was Quadra. So that's why the island, our island, was originally called Quadra Vancouver Island. But later, because of the decline of Spanish Empire, the island gradually called Vancouver Island.
oh,
Yeah,
wow.
very interesting story. Yeah.
thank you. Well, looks
Yeah.
like we'll have to get you back to talk about your next book as well.
Mhm.
There's
Oh, yeah,
lots
sorry.
of-
Actually, my book started from there. Because later, actually, I found I wrote more than 500 pages, too long. So that's why this is the second volume. But right now, actually, I'm writing for UBC for the first volume, starting from 1788. Yeah, sorry for interruption.
No, no, that's all right.
Yeah.
That's all right. Well, it's been a wonderful and rich
thank you.
evening learning about the history of our Chinatown. So please join me in thanking Dr. Chen again for his
Thank you.
great talk. And we have just one more public lecture in our series this fall. Next week, another historian, Dr. Justine Simmons, is here talking about sex crimes and the courts in France from 1500 to 1700. So we hope to see some of you then. Thanks very much.